The Buchardt E50 bookshelf speaker retails for about €39.50 or around $4,600 in today's standards. That's for the pair shipped to your door. Now, overall, these speakers have so many things that are great, but for me personally, it lacks one key thing, and that's attack. That's upper mid-range presence and clarity in dialogue. Now, according to Mads Buchardt, he said a lot of listening tests were conducted and that the majority of listeners preferred the sound that we hear from the speaker as is. And in fact, they went through a couple different trials of flat on-axis response and deviating from on-axis flat and even this scoop in the upper mid-range. And this scoop is what people preferred. Now, I get that people have a preference, but I'm going to tell you my preference. Having heard hundreds of speakers, having designed hundreds of systems, having tuned hundreds of different systems, I can tell you that I prefer a more smooth response in that upper mid-range region. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, let's look at KEF LS50. That is a speaker that has a notch in the upper mid-range. And then we also have something like the Wharfedale Linton that also has a notch in the upper mid-range. Now, when I listen to the Buchardt, immediately I notice that there's a lack of snare attack. And I know that some people are probably watching this and thinking, well, you say that about every speaker. Well, I say that about every speaker that sounds like that. And it just so happens that a lot of designs, because of crossover choices, sound like that. In this particular case, it was intentionally designed to sound like that. So going back to my preference, this doesn't quite hit my personal preference. My personal preference is something that is more neutral to this region because I like to feel the attack. I like to make my eyelids blink when a snare gets hit or somebody wails on a sax. I like to feel that almost liveliness. And of course, that is based upon the recording that you're listening to. But if you have a good recording and you know based on other information that it's supposed to sound like it has more attack to that region, then when it doesn't because of the speaker choice, I personally miss it. Now, some people like that. Some people might even call that a quote unquote warm sound. Now, some people will also call something that's warm just boosted up in the mid-range. I personally tend to call something that has a little bit of a dip in the upper mid-range relative to the lower mid-range. I would call that warm as well. So if you hear me refer to this speaker as warm, that's why. And not to nitpick on this speaker too much, but the high frequency for the speaker when it's faced directly at the listening position is probably going to be too bright for you. Certainly was for me. There was just too much hi-hat and too much snare. So my listening sessions typically tended toward pointing the speaker away from me. And ultimately, I found that about 20 degrees off axis, so pointing behind my listening position, that worked the best for these particular speakers. Now, outside of that being my only real complaint, this is a really good speaker. The bass gets really low. Now, the first track I played, I noticed that there was actually rumble in the bass. And then as I went through the rest of my music, I continuously noticed that. Now, sometimes when you play a speaker in your room, the track might highlight a certain note that is boosted by the room itself. And in that case, you may think, oh, wow, this gets low. And then you get to the next track, you're like, oh, yeah, it was just that one note, right? That's what we got, one note wonders. In this particular case, though, with every track that I threw at it, I continually noticed that there was lower bass extension than most bookshelf speakers that I've listened to. And when I look at the data, I saw that this gets anechoic down to about 40 hertz or so, which is pretty dang impressive for a speaker this size and its weight. Now, speaking of specs, let's talk about some of that real fast. This is a two-way passive radiator design. It features a 1-inch custom ScanSpeak dome tweeter with a waveguide. It features a 6.5-inch Purify extended stroke driver, and it has two 6.5-inch passive radiators on the back. Sensitivity is spec'd at 85 decibels. Crossover is spec'd at 2000 hertz with a first and third order slope. It weighs about 8.6 kilograms, and it comes in a few different colors and finishes. And you can tell by the looks of this thing, I think it looks awesome. Now, some people may not care for this look, but I think it looks awesome. And the way that the waveguide is integrated into the cutout of the baffle, not seeing screws, not seeing plastic to wood or something like that, you know, when you clearly see an installed driver, I just think that has a nice look of class. On the backside, we've got some ridiculously oversized banana jacks. So let's take it back to the listening. Now, as I said, I have a few nitpicks. The upper mid-range lacking some, let's say, detail, dynamics, some speech intelligibility with certain artists, and the high frequency just too much if it's pointed directly at you. The bass gets down super low. But I also really like the mid-range of the speaker. It's very neutral. There's no warmth to it. You know, I said earlier when I'm talking about warmth, I'm going to be talking about upper mid-range. So now I'm going to be talking about mid and lower mid-range. There's no warmth there. There's no coloration to it. There's no significant dip there that I see with a lot of speakers that don't have properly designed baffle step compensation. In those cases, they're designed to be placed either closer to a wall or they simply just were not designed well at all. This speaker in particular is designed very well in this regard. And I do think it's going to benefit from being brought out from the wall a little bit more than some other bookshelf speakers. Now, some other bookshelf speakers benefit from being placed close to the wall. So maybe they can get a little bit of boost in that lower mid-range area, but also boost in the mid-bass area where they start to roll off pretty quickly. This particular speaker, because it's also extended bass, I think that if you put it too close to a wall, you might find it to be a little bit too boomy. However, the flip side of that is if you do that, then you're going to generate additional free bass. And if you have equalization, you can bring some of those peaks down, and that might actually work better for you. So now let's do the pink noise sample. So the pink noise is the reference, and then the convolved speaker version is what the speaker will do to the source. This is what you just heard. The frequency response to the speaker's spec sensitivity is 85. I measured about 83.1 decibels. As you go from the bass region to the upper mid-range region, you can see that you're pretty dang neutral. I mean, you're almost flat. But when you hit about 1K, you kind of peak up at about almost 3 decibels, and then you dip down about 3 decibels through the upper mid-range and lower treble region. Now, most likely, if you heard a difference where it sounded maybe dull, maybe even sounded recessed, this right here is going to be why. You may possibly heard some higher information and that would have been boosted, but most likely, again, what you probably picked up on was this particular area right here. And it just sounds like almost like there's a hole in the response. That would be what causes it. Now, if you turn the speaker 30 degrees and face it directly out into the room, this is what you get. So you do decrease the higher frequency content some. You still have this dip through the upper mid-range, but it's not quite as severe. So instead of being plus or minus 3 decibels, maybe it's around like plus or minus 2 or 1.5 decibels. And this is part of the reason why I do recommend towing the speaker out. I found that the best mid-ground was actually the mid-ground. So anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees, I think is going to be your best bet. If you go and look at the bass, we can see that the F3 is at 40 hertz, F10 is at 34 hertz. So this speaker gets down to 40 hertz anechoic without any room gain. This is the CEA 2034 data set at 0 degrees on axis. And then if I go to 30 degrees off axis, you can see this is the data. Same thing we just discussed before. Note that the directivity of the speaker also shifts when you change the reference axis. So if I go to 0 degrees again, you got to dip through this upper mid-range area. Now, some of that's due to the horizontal, but then of course, some of that is also due to the spacing between the tweeter and the mid-range below it. If you go back to 30 degrees, you kind of smooth that out, and that's because of that 30 degrees horizontal. So that's the horizontal radiation of the mid-range, matching up to the tweeter a little bit better in this particular case. That's going to make your overall in-room response, at least in my opinion, better. And speaking of in-room response, let's take a look at this. So the black line represents pointed directly at you. Red line represents pointed out into the room, 30 degrees off axis in a room. And these are the notes that I have, right? So in-room extension to about 40 hertz. And I mean, you could argue and say that's even a little bit lower if you wanted to. Recessed upper vocals lacking attack of some instruments, primarily through this region, right through here. And then nice control directivity. So while this speaker does have nonlinearity, it has nonlinearity consistently. So on and off axis, which means that you could take equalization and you could boost up some of these areas that are not created by the crossover itself. If you look at the red representing 30 degrees, it shows that that scoop in the mid-range is probably more severe than the one directly on axis. That again is why I would recommend not quite 30, but not directly on axis as well. But of course, play around and see what you think. Burst decay shows a little bit of extended decay in the lower treble region. Horizontal contour plot shows us we get about plus or minus 60 degrees of radiation at the negative 6 dB point. And all that really means, if you're not sure, basically consider it like this. Wherever this dark red shifts over to a lighter red, that first changeover in color, that's going to be negative 6 decibels down. So that's almost half as loud. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb to say, all right, well, that's essentially how wide the speaker is going to radiate. And that will help you determine just how much stereo width you're going to get out of the speaker. So if a speaker radiates really narrow at like plus or minus 30 degrees, you're not going to have a lot of information hitting the sidewalls. And in a very lively room, that may be something that you want. Conversely, if you have a speaker that's radiating very widely, let's say plus or minus 60 degrees or even 80 degrees, I've seen that with some speakers, then you may like that sound because it sounds more enveloping. But if you have a lively room, it may also smear the imaging because it's too reflective in that room, and you might want a speaker that radiates a little bit more narrowly. These are all preferences. And how do you know what you like? Well, hopefully you have data and you have the opportunity to listen to a bunch of different speakers. And then from there, you can make your best educated decision on what to buy. Talk about the vertical. Sit at the tweeter axis. If you sit below the tweeter, if you treat this like some waveguide designs where it's intended that you listen between the tweeter and the midwoofer, so right at the middle, that's not going to work out for you. You're going to have a huge dip in that upper mid-range, even more than it already is right now. So make sure that you're sitting with your ears almost dead on axis with that tweeter level. Harmonic distortion at 86 decibels and then at 96 decibels. Look how clean and low this distortion is in the mid-range. So now let's look at multitone distortion. We can see with multitone distortion, we're creeping up on the upper mid-range. Now, some of this is because the upper mid-range in the frequency response is dipping, and this is relative. So if there's a dip in that fundamental response, then there's going to be a corresponding boost in the distortion because of that factor. But with that said, we still have low distortion in the mid-range, and it's below my 3% distortion threshold, at least up until the upper mid-range. So if we look at transient dynamic compression, we can see that this speaker does pretty well. There's a couple spots in here where it kind of dips into about 1 decibel or so at about 500 hertz. Now let's take a look at the impedance. The minimum EPDR of this speaker is 2.3 ohms. So if you have a class AB amplifier, make sure that it's well ventilated. And I would also say, keep in mind that sensitivity is at 83 decibels. So you're probably going to make sure you have plenty of power on tap. Now I'm using a pair of Macintosh MC611s, so I didn't run out of any steam. But having said that, you might want to get more than just the standard 50 or 100 watts. Just keep that in mind. Now, something else that I've introduced recently is amplifier pairing. Now, I'm not saying that I think you should spend your time buying different amplifiers for different speakers. Honestly, I think that's a total waste of time. I think you should get an amplifier that has good and low output impedance. But it is interesting to see just how sensitive a speaker is to different output impedance amplifiers. The ideal would be this black line, and that's the amplifier that I measure with an ideal impedance of less than 0.1 ohm. And if you increase that output impedance, so you say you go from a good solid state amplifier to a really bad, poorly designed set amplifier, tube amplifier, or something of that nature, then you start trending more and more from this black to this purple. So this purple represents a high output impedance amplifier. And you could change the mid-range response by as much as 2 decibels. You could boost the upper mid-range by about half a decibel, and you could drop the treble by a little bit more than half a decibel, almost 1 decibel. Now, if we put that in terms of frequency response, here we go. So the black is, again, my measured response, and then the blue, red, and purple are simulations based on a particular output impedance. And again, if we look down here, we can see that we lost about 2 decibels in the mid-range, and we gain about maybe a half a decibel upper mid-range, and we lose about maybe another decibel or so in the high frequency. What this really means, because you can't take these numbers just on their own, but you can draw conclusions from it. So what this tells us is that this speaker will actually and legitimately have a different tonal balance depending on the output impedance of your amplifier. The question is, what is the output impedance of your amplifier? Odds are you don't know. But if it's a good, new-ish solid state amplifier, it's probably so low you don't even have to worry about it. But if you're using some kind of funky tube amplifier or something from the 50s, then it's probably going to alter the sound, because this speaker's magnitude and phase of the impedance is designed in such a way that it is not impervious to different amplifiers. And with all that said, I'm done with this review. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know in the comment section below. If you don't mind, you'd like to support this channel, you can do so one of a couple different ways. One is you can join me at patreon.com, where I have inside information, exclusives, polls, giveaways, things of that nature. And it's a way to help me out and be a part of my community there. The other way is to use any of my generic affiliate links that are to Amazon or Crutchfield or Audio Advice, Best Buy, or whatever. There's a whole block of them in the section below. And if you don't mind, if you go buy something from somebody, any of these retailers, just remember to click on that link. That really helps me out a lot, and it doesn't cost you a single dime extra. Now, I appreciate it. I will talk to y'all later. Take care.